Right off, that's a tuba roaring in place of an otherwise silent Leo the lion. Hi, everybody, and a very pleasant good evening to you, wherever you may be. I am Richard Band. As you can see, this is Habeas Corpus, quintessential Laurel and Hardy black humor. Listening to this, we know you are serious about these films. Good for you. So you want scare comedy? Here it is. First thing to notice is the absence of George Stevens as the photographer in the credits, which are framed like gravestones. Hal Roach had assigned him to the then new Max Davidson series, so Stevens was only working with the Laurel and Hardy unit on an intermittent basis. Here shortly is Richard Carle as the obvious lunatic. Before Lucien Littlefield was cast as the eccentric scientist in Dirty Work, Mr. Carle was slated for that role. And with him here is Laurel's crony from the Carno troupe, Charlie Rogers, as the watchful detective and later as a corpse, but showing signs of life. If we hadn't seen Habeas Corpus before, we wouldn't know. This is a continuity error here, as Hardy isn't supposed to have paint stains on his sleeve until later when he tries to climb that street sign. So the film was not shot in sequence. In fact, the wet paint signpost scene was the first camera setup on the evening of July 16, 1928, which was the first night of shooting, and they worked from paragraphs 12 through 17 in the shooting script. And there are some other continuity errors here where things don't exactly match from scene to scene, but we don't care about that, do we? No, we don't. The poor hapless boy should have known Richard Carle was crazy, but he offers them, of all people, he offers them $500 to rob a grave, which is just shy of $9,000 in today's inflated money. The few interiors which open the picture here were shot on stage 2 on the 7th day of filming on a Monday morning at 8:30 a.m. Then that Wednesday, Stan Laurel was out ill for a few days. Principal photography and retakes on Habeas Corpus covered the dates from July 16 through August 8, 1928. They had to suspend production, as I say, when Stan Laurel took ill the second week. During that period, George Stevens was lining up shots elsewhere in both Max Davidson and Feed 'em and Weep, and Charlie Chase in a film called All Parts. So here are Stan Laurel, age 38, and Oliver Hardy, age 36, looking great in their prime. And reminiscent of One Good Turn, we just saw the boys as vagabonds, begging for a piece of buttered toast. So cinematography for the domestic negative, instead of by Stevens, is handled here by Len Powers, whom we associate with Hal Roach's beloved Dippy Doodad series, and John McBurney side by side for the export neg. Powers later lends the music box. He often worked with Charlie Chase, and the crowing rooster we see in titles for the Pathé films was shot by Powers. The detective is Leo Sulky, and shortly we'll see a cop who's Charles Bachman, sometimes a writer at the studio. The other fellow's name, lost to history. The genesis for this picture. Keaton made The Haunted House. Lloyd made Haunted Spooks. Our gang had just made spook spoofing, and Habeas Corpus would use the same cemetery gate and gravestones as seen in spook spoofing. In 1925, Stan Laurel directed a story he co-wrote to launch the new Clyde Cook series, Moonlight and Noses. Cook and Noah Young have the Laurel and Hardy roles in this dry run for Habeas Corpus. In 1927, the boys similarly find themselves in a graveyard for Do Detectives Think? They filmed these dark, spoofy graveyard exteriors, which we're about to see, on the back lot and bordering and adjacent to Hal Roach Studios on the southwest side, using one of the access streets which dead end at the studio loading docks. It would have to be Carson or Lindblad or Kruger or Hubbard. The casting sheets don't say. They should, but they don't. Now, a lot of producers would have shot this picture day for night using filters or on a stage, where they could control the lighting, the weather, the wind, the public, the traffic, etc., and save money. Money, money, money. Look how much better, how authentic this is instead. We shouldn't take it for granted, but the call each day of shooting, the first week, was for 7:30 p.m., and they'd work past midnight each day. There were no unions there then to wreck everything. The signpost with wet paint gag coming up shortly. You can see again in big noise. That is, if you can stand to watch the big noise. And by the way, why would workers have painted a street sign at night to still have it wet in this scene? Why? Because they wanted this gag, that's why. P.S. In the big noise, the boys reference a town in Texas. And Hardy means to say Corpus Christi, Texas, but, air quotes, mistakenly says instead Habeas Corpus. Of course, we know what he really means. And by Hardy's look, we know that he knows that we know that. As for that street sign, there is no Hunter and Third anywhere near Hal Roach Studios, or anywhere else that I know of. Habeas Corpus carries historical importance for being the first L&H film to add recorded sound on 2 discs with a synchronized music score, a powerful one, complete with inventive sound effects. Ages before I ever heard this score or knew who the 28 musicians were, I met one of them, an erudite and esoteric film history author, one of the first with distinguished literary works on Lubitsch, von Stroheim, and von Sternberg. He was Herman Weinberg, who pioneered the use of English subtitles for foreign films, starting with the advent of sound and on through the 1960s. He subtitled over 300 important foreign films. He plays the violin here for Habeas Corpus. Listen carefully. The studio expended $32,083 to produce Habeas Corpus, not counting $4,096 spent by the Victor Talking Machine Company to produce the sound. One problem. Get this. There were 22,300 theaters in the United States, but less than 200 were wired for sound that year. And yet Hal E. Roach went to all that trouble to add a track in 1928 for 1% of the theater audience. 1%, consider that. But forward thinking, he knew he had to transition into sound. In addition, Metro, as the distributor, spent $13,574 on prints and ads, bringing the total negative cost to $49,753. And for some price level change perspective, that's no less than $875,304 today. On the occasion of promoting Night Owl, Stan Laurel told the LA Times that the highest number of recorded laughs that were ever clocked for any of their pictures up through Night Owls was 128 for Habeas Corpus, proving that broad slapstick amidst scary situations works, really works. And that's the same cemetery gate you see in Our Gang spook spoofing. So as body snatchers, they top Battle, Big Business, Liberty, and Two Tars. That's a big deal. But you have to see these films in a theatrical situation, in the dark, with an audience, uncut and without interruption. That's when you're going to hear 128 laughs. Not on a cell phone or a laptop, and not on TV with the lights on and kids running around. 30 years later, in 1961, writing to a fan, Stan Laurel said of Habeas Corpus, quote, "It was a really funny short, even though the idea was gruesome." End quote. And coming up, that's Harry Wilde as the Night Watchman. It took me decades to identify him. In a perfect world, all silent Laurel and Hardy should look this good. We have stunning pictorial quality here, like you could walk right into the frame, and then right through those cemetery gates if we dared to. The status of the preprint material at this point is too involved to delve into here, except to say that the conversion, restoration, and preservation that I supervised for Munich was in 1993, and even then, the nitrate domestic camera day was missing some textiles and was seriously decomposing in 3 short sections of reel 1. But we see no evidence of that here today. Thank you, Serge Bromberg. It was 1994 when Dave McKinney and I were searching through random storage at RHI that we found a box with Victor's 2 discs containing the powerful music tracks we're listening to here. And coming up to the real change, here we'll see the boys climbing the wall reminiscent of trying to climb into the upper berth in their later birthmarks. But we know this is not going to work, right? Again, Laurel and Hardy look great here as opposed to something like Atoll K. And if you want a gruesome, scary, frightening, Laurel and Hardy, hair-raising, harrowing horror film, raised to the 10th power, Atoll K is the movie for you. But not for me. And if you're good at lip reading, especially in the second reel here, count how many times Mr. Laurel calls out to Mr. Hardy by his nickname Babe, as in, "Hey, Babe." At this point, we have no way of knowing specifically how involved creative Leo McCarey was or Hal Roach vis-a-vis Jimmy Parrott, Stan Laurel, and the gag writers, but I think any one of them would generously defer any kind of credit to this being a collaborative effort. On the affidavit for the copyright registration, the author of the screenplay was certified as Leo McCarey, but I think this was a contractual matter, and he was actually leaving a lot of fun when this picture went into general release. Laurel and Hardy and their production talent were reaching a creative zenith during this period, and while Habeas Corpus is not the kind of material they turn to often, they did know how to invest it with just enough scary stuff and genuine thrills to set off the comedic values and generate those record-setting 128 laughs. And stills exist showing a tall, eerie-looking old night-shirted character named Lon Poff, P-O-F-F, whose role as a ghoulish graveyard custodian on the second night of shooting was cut. One still showing him, however, was too good, and they used it on the lobby card set. This man was born right after the Civil War, and you can see him if you want to in Flash Gordon, Sullivan's Travels, and Father's Little Dividend, his last film in 1951. Now, they exposed 3,527 feet of film those first two nights of shooting, trying out, quote, lantern and turtle gags, which are coming up, of which about 30 minutes was deemed okay and good enough to print and work with. They had a real turtle, a prop turtle, and a double for Babe on those 2 days. In the Laurel and Hardy canon, Habeas Corpus is film number 25 of 106. Over 50 years ago, I was the one who numbered these movies on the first Laurel and Hardy filmography I did for Leonard Maltin in the book we did together way back then. It is the fourth release of the 1928-29 season, right after Two Tars and preceding We Fought Down. Now, some think this scene is protracted, climbing this wall and running around in the cemetery. But again, it plays perfectly when you experience this material in a theatrical setting with an audience. That's always where the magic happens. And something else we take for granted is how well lit these night scenes are. Study the shadows for a moment. If this crew didn't know what they were doing, it would jump right out at us. But they do, so it doesn't. Among the music cues, we have some familiar music I'm sure you will recognize. The title for one of these music cues, The Funeral March of the Marionettes. 27 years later, it was memorialized forever as the theme music for Alfred Hitchcock's TV series. Titles on some of the other macabre orchestral cues for the incidental music score include A Cannibal Carnival, Sketches, Dance, Barbare from Congo, Storm Music, and Mysterioso. There is no other Laurel and Hardy film with an amazing score like this one. The sequence here with the hand claps involving Rogers and Laurel was reworked, of course, a dozen years later, as you know, I'm sure, in A Chump at Oxford. In refining his characterization through the years, Stan would become less animated and more nuanced than the frantic pace he sets here, tangling with a fluttering bat, frightening him on the third night of work, a business that they would revisit again shortly in the Laurel-Hardy murder case. Now, when I worked for Black Hawk Films long ago, we tracked the sales of our 8mm and 16mm prints in the non-theatrical market, and films like Two Tars, Big Business, Cops, Easy Street, Haunted Spooks, and Habeas Corpus were always big sellers, and our labs would regularly wear out the printing negatives. The last retakes for Habeas Corpus were on August 8th. Then, this score was recorded on October 6th by Victor at the Trinity Baptist Church in Camden, New Jersey. way across the country. There were 2 Saturday night sessions, 5 to 8 p.m. and 9 to midnight. A delayed release ensued owing to the matter of deciding to breach the sound barrier for the first time, and Habeas Corpus was finally issued to theaters with this great musical score that few heard on December 1st, 1928. According to the casting call sheet for day 4 of shooting, right about here, we are watching effects produced by a, quote, smoke cloth and liquid smoke, whatever that is, and where in the wide world of sports would you get a thing like that? Also, hereabouts, we see an atypical gag with Stan leaping over a wall like a cartoon character or most anyone in a Senate comedy. The Hollywood trade papers carried stories like this one from Exhibitor's Daily Review. Quote, by the terms of contracts just signed between Hal Roach and the Victor Talking Machine Company, the Hal Roach Studios in Culver City, California will be allied for many years to come with the reproducing facilities of the Victor organization. This means the public will hear the Our Gang kids, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, Charlie Chase, and other Hal Roach stars in talking pictures. The Roach Studios are the only ones whose sound reproduction is operated by Victor. In making the announcement of his contract yesterday, Mr. Roach, who left for the coast, said that the combined efforts of the Victor Company and Hal Roach Studios can produce a new type of entertainment that will be happily received by exhibitors and the motion picture field at large, end quote. Well, happily received, that is as soon as the exhibitors can afford to make the serious investment required to wire their theaters to carry sound. We see the wind blowing. It could have been the wind machines or the so-called Santa Ana winds we experience in Los Angeles. Now, fellow Englishman Charlie Rogers was probably Stan Laurel's closest friend. Hal Roach told me that his value was as a gag man and as a sounding board for Laurel, not as a performer or director. Of Stan Laurel, Charlie Rogers said this to Jack McCabe, quote, he was the kindliest, nicest boss I ever had, and I've had plenty. And make no mistake, though we were good friends, he was still my boss and an exacting one. Exacting because he was thorough in all that he ever did when it came to the films, end quote. We just saw where they were mistaking the foot and toes for something ominous and using a spade for protection versus a gun, as seen later in Oliver VIII, with a variation on this gag. Apropos of which, the third night's work called for the use of 2 hand props, a prop bat, the flying variety, and a prop shovel, which had a practical application when some of the diggings accidentally collapsed during a rehearsal and partially buried Babe Hardy. So a lot of these gags are familiar and were reused because they work. The nominal director of Habeas Corpus was James Parrott, the younger brother by 5 years of Charlie Chase. Hal Roach always said, though, that it was Stan Laurel who, quote, bossed the set on any Laurel and Hardy picture. So anyone who was sitting in the big chair as director for the Laurel and Hardy unit had to be able to get along with Stan Laurel, and Parrott did. They were good friends, and they were fishing buddies. Jimmy Parrott was there almost from the start of Roland Pictures and Hal Roach Studios, years ahead of his older brother and Laurel and Hardy. He did bits, wrote gags, served as an assistant director, and then as a director. He offered some thoughts on working with Laurel and Hardy when he was directing Pardon Us, saying that, now this is Jimmy Parrott. There aren't many quotes that we have from Jimmy Parrott. A movie star is not a movie star when he is co-star. This is Jimmy Parrott speaking. Laurel and Hardy are one and the same when it comes to acting honors in a picture. I don't know offhand any 2 actors who share equal starring honors with as much grace and apparent unselfishness as do Stan and Babe. Their main thought while making a picture seems to be, is this good for the picture? And not, how much footage can I steal from my partner? Neither one tries to hog the camera or get more close-ups than the other. They have a mutual understanding in regards to the amount of the picture each man should appear in, and they never argue or fuss over the business to be done in any particular scene. Sometimes one of them must work a bit harder than the other, and when this occurs, the one with the least to do is always the first to offer assistance when it is needed, end quote. And Jimmy Parrott's credit as director can be found in such great shorts as 2 Tars, Helpmates, Hog Wild, Perfect Day, Blotto, Bratz, Another Fine Miss, The Hooskow, The Music Box, County Hospital, on, and he piloted his brother's best film, The Pip from Pittsburgh. The issue became, like his brother, Charlie Chase, he had a drinking problem. That led to a drug problem. These factors were complicated by a health issue, epilepsy, so that when Hal Roach Studios was forced to transition to feature film production, Jimmy Parrott could not be depended on. There was too much at stake with a feature film. Instead, he worked on stories and wrote gags for Way Out West and Blockheads. In May of 1939, the Hollywood trade papers ran with the story that James Parrott died of a heart attack at age 40. The walking body bag gag we've been seeing here can be traced to Moonlight and Noses, and in between to the Max Davidson comedy Dumb Daddies. Finally, for an ending different than and better than what the script called for, only in Laurel and Hardy land do we find mud puddles on street corners that are 6 feet deep, and it is always left to Mr. Hardy to plunge his dignity right down into what the studio's daily production sheet terms the mud hole. Was the water cold? Was it heated? Who knows? Well, I'm glad that's all cleared up, so until next time, I'm Richard Band saying Habeas Corpus, always a great time. I hope you enjoyed it.